On August 25th, 2026, a piece of America seemed to fall silent. Dolly Parton, the woman whose voice had carried heartbreak, hope, humor, and faith across more than 6 decades, died at the age of 80 in her native Tennessee. The news traveled quickly, but for millions of people, it was difficult to accept. Dolly had been famous for so long, had survived so many changes in music and culture, and had remained so relentlessly present that she seemed almost permanent. Generations had grown up with her songs playing in kitchens, cars, churches, bars, weddings, funerals, and family gatherings. Then, suddenly, the woman behind that unmistakable voice was gone. Almost immediately, tributes began pouring in from across the world. Musicians, actors, political figures, activists, fans, and ordinary families shared memories of what Dolly had meant to them. Some remembered her as the songwriter behind Jolene. Others thought of 9 to 5, the anthem that turned the frustrations of working women into something people could sing together. And for many, the first song that came to mind was I Will Always Love You, a farewell Dolly had written decades earlier that now seemed almost unbearably appropriate. But Dolly Parton had never been merely a country singer. She was something much harder to define. She was a woman who could walk into a room covered in rhinestones, towering hair, and impossible heels, make a joke about herself before anyone else could, and then quietly reveal a level of intelligence and business instinct that repeatedly surprised people who underestimated her. She understood early that her image could open the door, but her songwriting, ownership, discipline, and determination were what would keep her there. Behind all the glamour stood one of the most remarkable self-made careers in American entertainment. She eventually sold around 100 million records, wrote thousands of songs, accumulated major awards, became a film star, helped build Dollywood into an enormous attraction, and retained control over a valuable music catalog. Yet those statistics, impressive as they are, still fail to explain why her death felt so personal to people who had never met her. Perhaps it was because Dolly never seemed ashamed of where she came from. Long before Nashville, Hollywood, award shows, or global fame, she was a little girl growing up in rural East Tennessee in a family with 12 children. Money was scarce. Life in the Smoky Mountains could be difficult. But Dolly would later transform those memories into stories instead of hiding them. Poverty became material for songs. Family hardship became something she could describe with humor and tenderness. The mountains were never an embarrassment she needed to escape. They remained part of her identity for the rest of her life. Her connection to Tennessee eventually became more than nostalgia. Through Dollywood, charitable programs, disaster relief, and literacy initiatives, she poured money and attention back into the region that had raised her. Her presence helped transform the economy and identity of her hometown area, while also challenging stereotypes about Appalachian communities. And perhaps nothing demonstrated Dolly's priorities more clearly than the Imagination Library. The program began with an intensely personal inspiration. Dolly's father had been unable to read and write. Rather than treating that fact as a private family wound, Dolly turned it into a mission. Children began receiving free books directly in the mail. What started locally expanded enormously over the years, eventually distributing hundreds of millions of books to children around the world. That is why the mourning after her death stretched far beyond country music. People were grieving a songwriter, but they were also grieving a symbol of generosity. They were grieving someone who had somehow managed to remain recognizable without becoming frozen in time. She could appear alongside younger stars without seeming desperate to stay relevant. She could speak about religion without demanding that everyone believe exactly as she did. She could maintain friendships and admirers across political and cultural divisions while generally refusing to turn herself into a partisan weapon. Dolly seemed to understand something increasingly rare. Sometimes bringing people together required leaving room for them to be different. After her death, landmarks and institutions around the world honored her. The Empire State Building glowed pink. In Britain, the King's Guard performed 9 to 5. Famous musicians remembered her kindness as much as her talent. Fans repeated a simple phrase that could only have belonged to Dolly: "We will always love you." Yet beneath all these public tributes was another, more intimate story. Because the final chapter of Dolly Parton's life had not been without sorrow. In 2025, she lost Carl Dean, the husband she had loved for nearly 60 years. Their marriage had been unusual by celebrity standards. Carl largely avoided fame, rarely appeared publicly with Dolly, and built a private life beside one of the most recognizable women on earth. His death created an absence that Dolly could never disguise with rhinestones or jokes. Still, she kept working. She kept writing. She kept finding ways to speak about gratitude, faith, creativity, and the strange privilege of having lived long enough to look back on an extraordinary life. And that is where the story becomes even more emotional. Because when people now revisit Dolly Parton's final appearances and final public messages, certain words carry a different weight. Comments that once sounded like reflections from an aging artist can now feel like pieces of a farewell. To understand those words, however, we have to understand the woman who spoke them. And that story begins far away from fame, in the mountains of Tennessee, where a poor little girl discovered that even when you had almost nothing, you could still have a song. Before the rhinestones, before the awards, before Nashville knew her name, Dolly Parton was simply one of 12 children growing up in the mountains of East Tennessee. She was born on January 19, 1946, in a small cabin near Sevierville, Tennessee. Her family had very little money, and Dolly never tried to rewrite that part of her story. In fact, she often spoke about it with remarkable openness. Poverty was not something she romanticized, but neither was it something she allowed to define her as powerless. Her childhood was filled with hardship, crowded rooms, hand-me-down clothes, and constant financial uncertainty. Yet it was also filled with music, family, faith, imagination, and the kind of emotional closeness that would later become the foundation of some of her most powerful songs. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, worked hard to support the family through farming and construction jobs. Dolly admired his strength and practical intelligence, even though he had little formal education. Her mother, Avi Lee, brought music into the home and filled the children's lives with old ballads, hymns, and stories passed down through generations. Dolly would later credit her mother with helping shape her instinct for storytelling. In a house crowded with siblings, there was rarely much privacy. But Dolly found something that belonged entirely to her: music. She began singing almost as soon as she could speak. Church became one of her first stages. Her grandfather was a Pentecostal preacher, and Dolly absorbed the dramatic language, emotional intensity, and musical tradition of the church. For a child with a naturally powerful voice, those services were an education in performance. She learned something important very early. Music could change the feeling in a room. A song could make people cry. A song could make people hope. A song could make people feel less alone. And for Dolly, songwriting became a way to make sense of a world that was often difficult. She did not wait for adulthood to begin writing. As a child, she composed simple songs about the people, animals, and experiences around her. Every ordinary detail could become material. A broken heart, a family argument, a beautiful mountain morning, or a story overheard from an older relative could be transformed into lyrics. That instinct would never leave her. One of the most important things about Dolly Parton's career is that she was never merely a singer interpreting somebody else's emotions. She was a writer. Long before the world recognized that talent, she was already practicing it. When Dolly was still a child, her uncle Bill Owens saw something special in her. He helped her pursue opportunities beyond the mountains and encouraged her songwriting. By the time Dolly was around 10, she was already performing on local radio and television programs in Knoxville. Soon afterward, she recorded some of her earliest music. For many children, a local television appearance would have been an unforgettable adventure. For Dolly, it was a beginning. She became obsessed with the idea that somewhere beyond the mountains was a world where songs could become a career. Nashville was that world. To Dolly, Nashville was not simply a city. It represented possibility. It was the place where unknown writers could walk into publishing offices carrying notebooks and leave with the chance to hear their words on the radio. But getting there would not be easy. She had no powerful family connections in the industry, no large amount of money, no elite education, no guarantee that anyone would care. What she did have was ambition, and Dolly's ambition was enormous. Even as a teenager, she was already making trips to Nashville with her uncle, knocking on doors and trying to convince people to listen to her songs. Rejection was part of the process. The music business was crowded with young performers chasing the same dream. Dolly kept returning. That persistence became one of the defining patterns of her life. When somebody said no, she did not necessarily hear failure. She heard, "Try another door." There was another influence from Dolly's childhood that would later become central to her public identity: the women she saw around her. Dolly noticed beauty. She noticed clothing. She noticed how people reacted to appearance. One woman in particular became part of the mythology surrounding Dolly's famous look. Dolly recalled being fascinated as a child by a local woman who wore bright makeup, high heels, tight clothes, and dramatic hair. Adults around Dolly did not necessarily approve. Dolly thought she looked beautiful. Years later, when people mocked Dolly's exaggerated blonde hair, heavy makeup, and glamorous clothes, she rarely became defensive. She understood the joke better than anyone. She had created the image deliberately. The difference was that beneath the image was a woman paying extremely close attention to everything happening around her. Dolly knew that people often judged women by appearance before hearing what they had to say. Instead of fighting that reality directly, she learned how to use it. People might notice the hair first, then the voice, then the songs, and eventually, if they were paying attention, they would discover the mind behind all of it. That ability to control how the world saw her would later become one of Dolly Parton's greatest strengths. But before she could build the image, the business empire, or the legend, she had to make one enormous decision. The day after graduating from high school in 1964, Dolly Parton left home and headed for Nashville. She was 18 years old. She had little money. She had no idea exactly how her future would unfold. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not going back until Nashville knew her name. And almost immediately after arriving, Dolly met a young man named Carl Dean. Neither of them could have known it then, but that chance meeting would become the beginning of one of the most private and enduring love stories in American entertainment. At the same time, another relationship was waiting just ahead. One that would make Dolly famous, and eventually force her to choose between loyalty and freedom. When Dolly Parton arrived in Nashville in 1964, she was 18 years old, ambitious, determined, and almost completely unknown. She had talent, but talent was not enough. Nashville was full of people with beautiful voices and notebooks filled with songs. What separated Dolly from many of them was not simply the way she sang. It was the way she understood that every rejection, every small opportunity, and every connection could become part of a much larger journey. Her first years in Nashville were not glamorous. She worked hard, wrote constantly, and searched for any opening that might move her closer to the life she imagined. She initially found more success as a songwriter than as a recording artist. Other performers began recording songs she had helped write, giving Dolly an early lesson in one of the most important truths of the music business. Sometimes the person behind the song can be just as powerful as the person standing in front of the microphone. Then came the opportunity that changed everything. In 1967, Dolly joined the Porter Wagoner Show. Porter Wagoner was already an established country star with a popular television program and a loyal audience. For Dolly, joining his show meant national exposure, regular performances, and access to an audience far larger than anything she had experienced before. But the beginning was not easy. Porter's previous female singing partner had been popular, and some members of the audience were resistant to Dolly. She was the new girl. Some viewers did not want her. Dolly had to win them over. And she did. Week after week, she appeared beside Porter, singing duets and building her own identity. Her voice was unmistakable, but so was her personality. She was funny, self-aware, emotional, and ambitious in ways that were difficult to ignore. The partnership became successful. Very successful. Dolly and Porter recorded together, toured together, and became one of country music's most recognizable combinations. Their professional chemistry helped introduce Dolly to millions of listeners. For a time, Porter Wagoner was exactly what Dolly needed. But success can create a different kind of problem. The more famous Dolly became, the clearer it was that she had ideas for her career that extended beyond being part of someone else's show. She wanted independence. She wanted to write her own songs, shape her own image, pursue solo opportunities, and make decisions about her future without asking permission. That created tension. Leaving Porter was not simply a business decision. Their relationship had become complicated by years of collaboration, loyalty, gratitude, arguments, and emotional dependence. Dolly understood that Porter had helped give her a platform. She also understood that staying too long could prevent her from becoming the artist she believed she was meant to be. So she did what Dolly Parton often did when ordinary conversation was not enough. She wrote a song. That song was, "I Will Always Love You." Today, many people hear those words and immediately think of romantic heartbreak. But Dolly originally wrote the song as a farewell to Porter Wagoner. It was not an attack. It was not revenge. It was gratitude mixed with goodbye. Dolly was saying, in essence, that she could appreciate everything Porter had done for her while still choosing to leave. The song became one of the most important compositions of her career. More importantly, the decision behind it revealed something fundamental about Dolly Parton. She was loyal, but she was not willing to surrender her future in the name of loyalty. That distinction would define much of her life. By the early 1970s, Dolly was increasingly proving that she could stand alone. Songs like Coat of Many Colors showed how deeply she could transform personal memory into universal emotion. The story behind Coat of Many Colors came from her childhood. Dolly remembered her mother sewing together scraps of fabric to make her a coat because the family could not afford something new. Her mother tried to make the garment feel special by telling Dolly the biblical story of Joseph and his coat of many colors. Dolly wore it proudly. Then other children laughed at her. In someone else's hands, that memory might have remained a painful childhood humiliation. Dolly turned it into art. That was her gift. She did not erase pain. She translated it. Then came Jolene. The song was inspired by jealousy and insecurity, emotions Dolly was willing to admit rather than hide. Instead of writing herself as a powerful woman confidently defeating a rival, she wrote from vulnerability. "Please don't take him." That emotional honesty helped make the song timeless. Dolly understood that people connected not with perfection, but with fear, longing, embarrassment, and heartbreak. By the mid-1970s, her solo career was becoming impossible to contain. She had crossed the line from successful country singer to major star. And she wanted more. Country music had given Dolly her foundation, but she could see possibilities beyond it. Television, movies, pop audience, business, ownership. Some traditional country fans worried that she was changing. Others accused her of becoming too commercial. Dolly kept moving forward. What looked like reinvention from the outside was, to her, simply expansion. She had spent her childhood watching mountains surround her. Now she refused to let any boundaries surround her career. And behind the music, another decision would prove just as important. Dolly understood the value of ownership. She had seen how artists could make famous songs, yet lose control over the rights that generated money for decades. So she fought to keep control over publishing and catalog whenever possible. That decision would later make her not only a music legend, but an extraordinarily powerful businesswoman. It would also lead to one of the most famous stories in entertainment history. Years later, another superstar would want to record, "I Will Always Love You." The potential deal could have made Dolly an enormous amount of money immediately. But there was a condition. Dolly would have to surrender part of the publishing rights. She said no. It looked risky. It turned out to be one of the smartest decisions of her life. Because the song was not finished making history. And neither was Dolly Parton. While Dolly Parton was becoming one of the most recognizable women in America, there was one part of her life she guarded with extraordinary care. Her marriage. Dolly met Carl Dean in Nashville in 1964, shortly after she arrived in the city as an 18-year-old chasing a music career. Their meeting was simple, almost ordinary, and completely unlike the larger-than-life story that Dolly's career would soon become. Carl was not a singer. He was not an actor. He was not interested in becoming famous. And perhaps that was exactly why the relationship worked. As Dolly's career exploded, Carl did almost the opposite. He stayed away from cameras, red carpets, award shows, and the machinery of celebrity. He preferred privacy. He built a life that existed beside Dolly's public world without becoming part of it. They married in 1966. For decades afterward, their relationship fascinated the public precisely because so little of it was visible. People saw Dolly everywhere. They almost never saw Carl. That absence created endless curiosity. Some fans joked that Carl was so private he seemed almost fictional. Dolly laughed about it too. She often told stories about his reluctance to attend public events and his complete lack of interest in celebrity culture. But beneath the humor was something more serious. Dolly understood that fame can consume everything around it if you allow it to. So she protected their marriage. She traveled constantly, recorded albums, performed around the world, acted in films, built businesses, appeared on television, and became a global icon. Then she returned home to a husband who knew her before the costumes, the awards, and the mythology. That contrast gave her something fame could not. Normalcy. Carl reportedly preferred simple routines and a quiet life. He supported Dolly's career without trying to become part of it. Their marriage was unconventional in the sense that they spent long stretches apart because of her work, but Dolly frequently insisted that the space helped them remain together. They had no children of their own. That decision and circumstance also became part of Dolly's public story. Over the years, she spoke openly about the fact that her life had taken a different path. Rather than framing it only as a loss, she often connected it to the enormous number of children she reached through her literacy work and extended family. Still, even the strongest private life cannot escape time. In March 2025, Carl Dean died at the age of 82 after nearly 60 years of marriage to Dolly. The loss was immense. Dolly had spent most of her adult life with him. The public knew Carl primarily through Dolly's stories, but for Dolly, he was not a story. He was home. She responded to his death in the way she had responded to so many painful moments throughout her life. She turned emotion into music. Dolly released a song titled "If You Hadn't Been There," written as a tribute to Carl and the life they had shared. The song did not attempt to erase grief. Instead, it acknowledged the enormous influence one person can have simply by standing beside another for decades. After Carl's death, Dolly continued working. That did not mean the grief was gone. One of the most misunderstood things about Dolly Parton was the way her humor could make pain look lighter than it really was. She joked when she was nervous. She smiled when discussing difficult memories. She wore bright clothes through dark moments. For some people, that might have looked like avoidance. For Dolly, it appeared to be survival. She had always known how to carry sadness without allowing it to consume the room. But the final years of her life brought more than one challenge. As Dolly moved through her late 70s and into her 80s, fans began noticing changes. Some major public appearances became less frequent. Certain performances were scaled back. Her schedule, once seemingly endless, began to shift. Dolly remained active creatively, but age was impossible to ignore. And then came concerns about her health. At various points, Dolly postponed or canceled appearances while dealing with medical issues. Because she had spent decades projecting energy and humor, even minor signs of vulnerability could alarm fans. Rumors spread quickly. Some were exaggerated. Others had no reliable evidence behind them. Dolly herself often tried to calm people. She remained determined to control the narrative around her own life rather than allowing speculation to define it. That instinct made sense. She had spent 60 years controlling her songs, her image, her business, her public identity. Why would she surrender control of her final chapter? In interviews, Dolly continued to speak about creativity as if retirement were almost impossible for her to imagine. She had often said that she hoped to keep working for as long as she was able. To Dolly, songwriting was not simply a job she could leave behind. It was how she processed life. It was how she understood grief. It was how she remembered Carl. It was how she remembered her parents. It was how she remembered the mountains. And increasingly, it was how she thought about mortality. By the time Dolly reached 80, she had already outlived many friends, collaborators, and members of her generation. She had also lived through the death of the man who had been beside her for nearly 6 decades. That kind of loss changes the way a person looks at time. The future becomes shorter. Memory becomes heavier. Ordinary days become more valuable. And yet Dolly kept planning. She still had music she wanted to make, stories she wanted to tell, projects she wanted to finish. That determination made what happened next even more difficult for fans to accept. Because behind the smiles and the familiar jokes, Dolly's health was becoming a growing concern. And soon, the woman who had spent a lifetime telling everyone else's stories would begin speaking more openly about how she wanted her own story to end. For most of Dolly Parton's life, slowing down seemed almost unnatural. She had built her identity around movement, writing before sunrise, recording music, developing businesses, supporting charities, planning new projects, and somehow finding the energy to remain connected to fans even after 6 decades in the spotlight. That was why the changes that appeared during her final years felt so unsettling. Dolly had always joked about aging, often treating it as one more subject she could laugh at before anyone else did. But by 2025 and 2026, the concerns surrounding her health were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. The first major alarm came when she postponed her planned Las Vegas residency because of health challenges. Those shows were supposed to mark a major return to the stage, but Dolly explained that doctors wanted her to undergo procedures and give herself time to recover. For an artist who had spent a lifetime insisting that she would keep working as long as possible, postponing performances was significant. Then, in May 2026, the situation changed again. Dolly canceled the residency entirely. She revealed that she had been dealing with problems involving her immune and digestive systems, and that the medication she was taking could leave her dizzy. With characteristic humor, she joked that being lightheaded while carrying instruments in 5-inch heels was probably not a good idea. The joke sounded exactly like Dolly, but beneath it was a reality fans could no longer ignore. Her body was forcing her to make choices her ambition never would have made voluntarily. Still, Dolly refused to disappear. She continued developing projects, recording messages, discussing new ventures, and making occasional public appearances. In June 2026, she surprised fans by attending the opening of a travel stop in Tennessee. Those who saw her described her as cheerful and energetic, and for a moment, it seemed possible that the worst fears surrounding her health had been exaggerated. That was part of what made Dolly's final months so emotionally confusing. One appearance could make her seem as lively as ever, while the next cancellation reminded everyone that something more serious was happening behind the scenes. Dolly herself tried to strike a balance between honesty and reassurance. She did not want people assuming the worst, but she also stopped pretending that everything was normal. In August, after missing another scheduled appearance at Dollywood because of dizziness and dehydration, she spoke more openly about what she had been experiencing. She acknowledged that she was dealing with health problems she had not properly addressed while caring for Carl Dean during his final years. Her husband had been the center of her private world for nearly 60 years, and as his health declined, Dolly's attention had understandably turned toward him. Only after Carl was gone did she begin confronting some of the physical problems she had pushed aside. That admission changed the way many fans viewed Dolly's final chapter. She had spent her life taking care of others in very public ways. She gave books to children through the Imagination Library, supported communities after disasters, helped fund medical research, assisted families in Tennessee, and repeatedly used her wealth and influence to create opportunities for people she would never meet. Yet in private, during one of the most painful periods of her life, she had also been taking care of the man who had been beside her from the beginning. Somewhere in that process, she admitted she had neglected herself. And even then, Dolly did not speak like someone preparing to surrender. In one of her final interviews, published on August 21st, 2026, she talked about the health struggles she had endured and reminded readers that illness was not entirely new to her. She had faced serious problems decades earlier and had recovered. She emphasized that she still had things she wanted to accomplish. New projects were moving forward, including a Nashville museum devoted to her life and a hotel connected to her growing business presence in the city. She continued talking about future plans with the enthusiasm of someone who assumed there would always be another song, another opening, another idea waiting to become real. That may be one of the saddest details of all. Dolly Parton did not sound like a woman who believed her work was finished. She sounded like Dolly Parton. She was still planning, still creating, still imagining. Even when her health forced her away from the stage, she began considering other ways technology might allow her to remain connected to audiences. Work was not simply something Dolly did for money. By then, she had more than enough success to stop. Work gave structure to her life. Creativity gave her a reason to get out of bed. Songwriting gave her somewhere to put grief that could not be solved. And after Carl's death, that need may have become even more important. There was also something deeply revealing in the way Dolly spoke about her own story during this period. She had been developing a musical based on her life and explained that she wanted to tell that story while she was still alive. She wanted people to hear the experiences behind the famous songs from her perspective, not only through biographies written after she was gone. At the time, those words could easily have sounded like the reflections of an 80-year-old artist taking control of her legacy. After her death, they felt different. They sounded almost prophetic. Dolly had spent decades knowing that songs could preserve moments long after the people inside them disappeared. She had written about her mother, her childhood, poverty, jealousy, heartbreak, Carl, faith, and goodbye. Perhaps she understood better than most that once a person is gone, other people begin telling their story for them. So Dolly wanted to leave behind her own version while she still could. Yet there was one final public message still to come. Only days before the world learned that Dolly Parton was gone, she appeared virtually to accept an honor for the thing that had always mattered most to her: songwriting. She spoke about what songs had given her throughout her life, about healing, faith, and the strange way music could carry pain somewhere words alone could not. At the time, it was an acceptance speech. After August 25th, it became something else entirely. For millions of fans hearing those words again, it sounded like Dolly Parton had unknowingly given them one last goodbye. Only days before Dolly Parton's death, she appeared virtually to accept the ACM Honors Poets Award, and what might have seemed at the time like another gracious acceptance speech now carries a weight that is almost impossible to ignore. Dolly had spent her entire life writing songs about love, loss, faith, memory, family, and goodbye, so it was fitting that one of her final public messages centered on songwriting itself. She spoke about songs not as products, awards, or commercial achievements, but as something much more intimate. For Dolly, writing had always been a form of release. It was how she processed pain, how she survived disappointment, how she held on to people she loved, and how she turned difficult experiences into something that could help somebody else. In that final message, Dolly described songwriting as a kind of therapy. She spoke about the comfort she found in putting emotions into words and music, and about her belief that the ability to write songs was a gift from God. It was not a dramatic farewell. She did not announce that she was saying goodbye. There was no carefully staged final speech designed to make people cry. That is exactly why the message became so powerful after her death. It sounded natural, familiar, almost ordinary for Dolly. She was still smiling, still expressing gratitude, still talking about creativity as something sacred. And yet, looking back, every sentence seemed to carry a different meaning. People.com https://people.com/dolly-parton-accepts-ACM-honors-poets-award-virtually-1206474 8 CHATGPT. For decades, Dolly had been asked about the secret behind her longevity, and her answers often returned to the same themes: work, faith, humor, gratitude, and the refusal to stop dreaming. Even in her final months, when her health had forced her to cancel plans and reduce appearances, she continued talking about the future. She was developing a museum in Nashville. She remained involved with new creative projects. She had been working on a musical based on her life. She was still thinking about songs she wanted to write and stories she wanted to tell. That made her death feel especially abrupt, because there was no sense that Dolly had mentally retired from life. She was still looking forward, still planning, still creating. But perhaps that is what made her final words about songwriting so revealing. Dolly did not need a perfect ending, because she had spent her entire life preparing for one without realizing it. Every song had been a piece of testimony. Every story had preserved another part of her. Every joke had allowed her to speak about difficult things without being destroyed by them. She had written her own emotional archive in public. There was the little girl in coat of many colors, learning that love could make something valuable even when money was absent. There was the frightened woman in Jolene, admitting insecurity instead of pretending to be invincible. There was the determined employee in 9 to 5, demanding dignity from a system that treated working people as disposable. There was the farewell in I Will Always Love You, proving that leaving somebody did not require hatred. And in the music she created after Carl Dean's death, there was the widow looking backward at nearly 60 years beside one man and trying to understand what his presence had meant to her life. Dolly's final message about songwriting connected all of those versions of herself. It reminded people that the songs were not separate from her life. They were the method she used to survive it. There was another statement from Dolly's final period that became increasingly emotional after her death. While discussing the musical based on her life, she explained that she wanted to tell her own story while she was still alive. She understood how quickly people become legends after death, and how legends can flatten complicated lives into simple images. Dolly did not want to become only the blonde wig, the rhinestones, the famous laugh, or the woman who wrote a handful of unforgettable songs. She wanted people to understand the poverty, the ambition, the marriage, the sacrifices, the failures, the business decisions, the faith, the insecurity, and the discipline underneath the image. People.com https Dolly Parton told people, I wanted to tell my story while I was still alive 1 year before her death. Exclusive resource equal. That desire was deeply consistent with who Dolly had always been. She spent her career controlling her publishing when she could. She controlled her image. She controlled the jokes people made about her by making them first. She controlled how much of her marriage entered the public world. And near the end, she wanted to control the story of her own life too. Perhaps she knew that death eventually takes that control away from everyone. Once a person is gone, other people decide which photographs are remembered, which mistakes are repeated, which stories become mythology, and which parts quietly disappear. Dolly wanted to leave enough behind that nobody could reduce her to a caricature. She succeeded. After her death, fans began returning to old interviews and performances, searching for clues they might have missed. That is something people often do when a beloved figure dies. Ordinary sentences suddenly sound like warnings. Casual remarks become final statements. Smiles become painful because viewers know something the person on the screen did not. But with Dolly, the most meaningful material did not require conspiracy or speculation. She had spoken openly for years about mortality. She had often said that she wanted to work until she could not work anymore. She had joked about dying on stage someday. She had talked about heaven, about seeing loved ones again, and about trusting God with the things she could not control. Her faith was not something added to her story at the end. It had been there since the beginning, rooted in the mountain churches of Tennessee, and carried through every stage of her career. That faith likely shaped the calmness with which she discussed aging. Dolly knew she could not control time. She could only control what she did with it. And, right until the end, she kept doing what she had always done. She created. She encouraged. She gave. She worked. She made people laugh. And she wrote songs. That is why her final public message became more than an acceptance speech. In hindsight, it sounded like a summary of the life she had lived. Dolly Parton had spent 80 years turning pain into music and music into connection. She had given people words for feelings they could not always explain themselves. And then, almost without warning, the voice behind those words was gone. But Dolly had understood something long before the rest of us did. A songwriter does not completely disappear when the body is gone. The voice remains in recordings. The stories remain in lyrics. The memories remain in the people who heard them. And somewhere, at this very moment, a little girl who never met Dolly Parton may be opening a free book delivered through the Imagination Library. Somewhere else, someone is playing Jolene. Someone is driving home after a terrible day listening to 9 to 5. Someone is grieving a relationship while I Will Always Love You plays quietly in the background. That may have been Dolly Parton's real final message all along. Not that people should mourn forever, but that what we give away while we are alive can continue moving through the world long after we are gone. And as America prepared to say goodbye to one of its most beloved voices, one final question remained. How do you measure the life of someone whose influence reached far beyond music, into homes, schools, hospitals, businesses, communities, and millions of childhood memories? The answer would become clear in the days after her death, when the world began to realize that Dolly Parton had not simply left behind a catalog of songs. She had left behind an entire way of seeing life. In the days after Dolly Parton's death, the world did what it always does when a truly irreplaceable figure is gone. It began trying to understand the size of the loss. Tributes appeared everywhere. Musicians spoke about the songs that had shaped them. Actors remembered her generosity and humor. Fans shared photographs, concert tickets, old records, handwritten letters, and stories about the first time they heard her voice. Some remembered Dolly as the glamorous blonde country star who could fill an arena with laughter before breaking hearts with a single verse. Others remembered her as the woman whose foundation had mailed books to their children. Some knew her through Dollywood, some through movies, some through Jolene, 9 to 5, or Coat of Many Colors, and some knew only one song, I Will Always Love You. Yet somehow, all of those different memories belonged to the same woman. That was the strange power of Dolly Parton. She belonged to country music, but she was never contained by it. She came from a specific place, a specific faith, and a specific culture, yet she reached people who shared none of those things. She could speak openly about God, while remaining beloved by people who did not believe what she believed. She could become fabulously wealthy without pretending she had forgotten poverty. She could build a business empire without losing the image of the mountain girl who once lived in a crowded cabin in Tennessee. She could become one of the most recognizable women on earth, while keeping the most important relationship of her life largely hidden from public view. Contradictions like those did not weaken Dolly's image. They made it human. She was both carefully constructed and deeply authentic. She understood exactly what people saw when they looked at her, and she enjoyed playing with those expectations. The hair was exaggerated. The clothes were exaggerated. The makeup was exaggerated. But the discipline underneath all of it was completely real. Dolly worked harder than many people realized. Behind the jokes was a songwriter who could sit alone with a guitar and reduce a complicated emotion to a few unforgettable lines. Behind the rhinestones was a businesswoman who understood ownership, licensing, branding, publishing, and long-term value. Behind the celebrity was a philanthropist who believed that success meant very little if it never reached anyone else. That last part may ultimately become the most important chapter of her legacy. The Imagination Library began as a tribute to her father, a man Dolly adored who had never learned to read and write. What started as a local effort to send books to children grew into an international literacy program distributing hundreds of millions of books. That achievement cannot be measured in awards or record sales. It lives in bedrooms, schools, family rooms, and the hands of children who may not even know who Dolly Parton was when their first book arrived. That may be the purest form of legacy, helping someone who does not know your name. Dolly also repeatedly used her wealth in moments of crisis, supporting communities affected by disaster and contributing to causes she believed could improve lives. She rarely presented generosity as a heroic act. It was simply part of what she believed people should do when they had the ability to help. And that philosophy made the contrast between Dolly's childhood and later life even more remarkable. The girl who grew up with almost nothing became a woman capable of giving away enormous amounts of money, attention, and opportunity. But she never seemed embarrassed by the beginning. In fact, she carried it everywhere. Tennessee remained central to her identity. The mountains remained part of her language. Her parents remained part of her songs. Carl remained part of her private heart. Even after fame transformed almost every practical detail of her life, Dolly continued returning emotionally to where she started. Perhaps that is why her death felt less like the passing of a celebrity and more like the closing of a chapter in American culture. Dolly represented an era when country music could still feel connected to front porches, churches, family stories, regional accents, and ordinary hardship. Yet she also represented reinvention. She crossed into pop music, television, movies, theme parks, publishing, philanthropy, and business without surrendering the identity that made her distinctive in the first place. She did not become universal by becoming generic. She became universal by being unmistakably herself. And then there was the music. Long after headlines fade and biographies settle into libraries, the songs will remain. Somewhere, Jolene will still sound urgent because jealousy does not become outdated. Coat of Many Colors will still matter because children will always understand what it feels like to be laughed at for something they cannot control. 9 to 5 will still connect with people who feel undervalued at work. I Will Always Love You will still break hearts because love and separation will always belong to the human experience. That is the difference between a hit and a standard. Hits belong to a moment. Standards survive the people who created them. Dolly Parton wrote standards. And perhaps that is why the title of her most famous farewell now feels almost impossible to separate from her own death. I Will Always Love You was never written as a funeral song. It was written decades earlier as a goodbye to Porter Wagoner, a way of expressing affection while still choosing freedom. But after Dolly was gone, the words took on another meaning. Fans were no longer hearing only one person saying goodbye to another. They were hearing millions of people saying goodbye to Dolly. The emotional reversal was almost perfect. She had written the farewell, but now the world was singing it back to her. Yet if Dolly Parton's life teaches anything, it is that goodbye does not have to mean disappearance. She understood that better than most. She spent decades preserving pieces of herself in songs, stories, businesses, books, friendships, charitable programs, and memories. She left evidence everywhere. Not evidence that she had been famous, but evidence that she had participated fully in life. She loved. She grieved. She worked. She failed. She fought for independence. She made mistakes. She gave. She laughed at herself. She protected what mattered. And even near the end, she kept creating. Maybe that is the final reason people will continue missing Dolly Parton. She never presented herself as someone above the audience. She made people feel invited into the story. She could stand beneath enormous stage lights and still sound like someone telling you something personal across a kitchen table. That intimacy was one of her greatest gifts. So when the world says goodbye to Dolly Parton, perhaps the most fitting tribute is not silence. It is music. It is laughter. It is generosity. It is picking up a book and reading to a child. It is refusing to let hardship erase ambition. It is remembering that where you begin does not have to determine where you end. And it is understanding that a life is not measured only by how long someone stays, but by what continues after they leave. Dolly Parton may be gone, but the mountains still remember her. Nashville still carries her fingerprints. Millions of books still arrive in children's hands. Her songs still play. Her voice still rises from old records and new playlists. And every time someone hears that familiar melody and whispers the words, "I will always love you," Dolly Parton, in some small way, is still here.